This is the final podcast in the series of why the church changed from the celebration of Passover to the celebration of Easter. And last week I finished on the subject of the British Isles being divided in its system of worship between the system that God put in place in Leviticus 23 and the one that Yeshua followed and the apostles, and the system that Babylon and subsequently Rome had taken on in those early centuries of the church. So the believers in Ireland and Scotland and Wales had received the gospel message through missionaries from Israel, and they were practicing their faith, celebrating as God had directed. Spiritual leaders such as Patrick in Ireland kept Sabbath and Passover and the other biblical festivals, and in his writings it suggested that he had Jewish heritage himself. He influenced the teachings of Columba, who established a community of believers in areas around Iona in Scotland and in the north of England, and they kept God's feasts of Passover and Sabbath. In 664 AD, emissaries from Rome called a synod, meaning a religious meeting, at Whitby in the north of England to try to unify the worship practice of all believers by having them change to the celebration of Easter, and Sunday worship, which was inaugurated for the worship of Sol Invictus by Constantine. These emissaries deceived Columba's community at Whitby into believing that the Apostle Peter himself had changed the worship of Yeshua as the Passover lamb to the celebration of Easter, connected to the timing of the fertility goddess and Sunday. And the Columba and Iona community agreed under pressure and through deceit to make these changes. Later in the 7th century, attempts by emissaries from Rome failed to convince the Welsh believers to change from Sabbath to Sunday and from Passover to Easter, which resulted in the slaughter of a community of Welsh believers at a village called Bangor-on-Dee in North Wales sometime around 722 AD. The persecution of believers who kept the Sabbath and Passover continued in Wales until 1100 AD. In Scotland and Ireland until 1115 AD, when they were forced ultimately to change to comply with the Roman system of worship. Although I want to focus on the replacement of Passover with the celebration of Easter, I want to mention the persecution of Sabbath keepers across Europe and the British Isles, which continued until the 17th century. In 1661, a Baptist pastor called John James, who ministered on the Sabbath in Whitechapel in London, was the last believer hung for keeping Sabbath. And during this period, thousands of Sabbath keepers here in the British Isles were imprisoned for long periods because they refused to celebrate on a Sunday. This took place under legislation enforced by the newly formed Protestant church, such as the Conventicles Act and the 5 Mile Act, and the Book of Common Prayer, which enforced compliance with Sunday worship. I have written a booklet specifically on this subject. Even today, those of us who have returned to God's ways by celebrating his times and laws, such as Sabbath and Passover, often become ostracized by the traditional church and are largely seen as heretics. That, however, has always been the case. But we must and are called to give a proper understanding of the will of God for his church. So we must face this isolation and vilification which come at us from every church which practices a system of worship which was established by Rome and ultimately rooted in Babylon. There is an assumption that under the Reformation initiated by Luther in the 16th century, the new Protestant communion pulled away from the Catholic Church and its pagan practices, and that they were no longer a part of Rome. To answer this, we must understand that the Roman Empire, as Daniel describes it, is the spiritual Roman Empire with its Babylonian system of worship. This empire's spirituality form began its worship system in Pergamon, referred to by the emperors, including Constantine, as their place of worship, but referred to as by John in the book of Revelation as the seat of Satan. And that worship system continued through the proclamations of the emperors, including Constantine, who changed the Sabbath to the worship of Sol Invictus, Sunday worship, and Passover to Easter. Damasus, the new Babylonian priest or pontiff, elaborated this worship system, which today is manifest in every church which celebrates Sunday as the day of worship and rest and celebrates Christmas and Easter, and not the Feast of Tabernacles and Passover as God directed we should. I must mention here that most worshippers in this spiritual Roman Empire have no understanding that they are celebrating these Babylonian feasts, as they are taught that these are the festivals Yeshua and the apostles told us to follow as celebrations of his work of salvation. However, that is not true. And when Yeshua returns, he will establish a new empire on the earth, which is his kingdom being established on the earth, and he will re-establish the worship system which God instituted in the skies at the time of creation and through the Jewish people in our own times. This doesn't mean that God will judge those in Christendom if they have no idea they're not obeying him. But he does want us to change to his times and laws once we do understand. And that is what we are doing and once we understand that what we are doing is wrong and rooted in the worship of other gods, we must change. So how do we return to God's calendar? So how do we change, and how hard will it be, and who will we offend? The truth is that it is difficult to change back to a godly calendar of worship when we've been celebrating the traditions of man for so long. And we will, of course, offend those around us who totally disagree, despite how hard we try to limit that offense. Once we understand, however, that Easter is a pagan festival, we have to change our practice if we are to be obedient to God and go back to the ancient paths God has set before us, and not continue to be spiritually ensnared by a pagan calendar. My advice is to explain to those around you why you are celebrating Passover and not Easter, and try to find fellowships who do so to help you on your journey. My second piece of advice is don't mix celebrating Easter and Passover. And despite the fact that sometimes they occur at the same time or a similar time in our Gregorian calendar, make sure you are clear to others what you are celebrating. Most who celebrate Easter and oppose moving to celebrate Passover question when the celebration of Yeshua's resurrection was to be. So it is important to understand that Passover is followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Feast of First Fruits in the same week, as the latter two are part of the Passover celebrations. The Feast of First Fruits is always celebrated on the first day of the week after the first Sabbath after Passover. So if Passover Eve is on a Wednesday, First Fruits is celebrated on the following Sunday. The importance of me pointing this out is because First Fruits is fulfilled by Yeshua through his resurrection. So we celebrate his resurrection by celebrating the Feast of First Fruits. In the first paragraphs of this booklet, I spoke about spiritual forces which cause us to be spiritually imprisoned in so many forms. In celebrating God's feasts, all of which Yeshua fulfilled, we can better understand that we are free from those spiritual forces which would ensnare us into believing myths which point us towards the gods of the Babylonians. We are no longer in a place where we are trying to defend the teaching of Good Friday and it is ambiguous, and its ambiguous connection to the resurrection and the 3 days Yeshua spent in the tomb, or trying to fit the symbol of the eggs and rabbits into the explanation of the crucifixion and resurrection. We now know the origins of these things, and we can see the importance of God's feasts and how he frees us from slavery to sin, which Passover reminds us of in a very deep and meaningful way. So I hope you and pray that you've been able to receive what I've taught about in my podcasts over the last few weeks, and what I've written in my booklet concerning the subject of why the church changed from Passover to Easter, and do so with an open heart. I want to bless your walk with God and pray that you would join me as we continue to learn together God's ways, his times, and his seasons. So if we can help any more with your walk and help guide you and teach you, you can use the facilities of Father's House and join with us in worship at any time, or join with us in our celebrations of these wonderful feasts. Or you can contact us through our website, www.fathershouse.wales, or contact us through our Facebook page. But the main and the important thing to remember is that God has set feasts in place at specific times and seasons, and he sent his Son to fulfill each and every one, that we, both Jew and Gentile, can receive salvation and give glory to the God of creation, who ultimately did all this for us. So Hag Shemeach, Pesach, Happy Passover, and Shabbat Shalom. Mike Fryer from Wales.